Don't we all love to be known by name? I mean, to know that someone has thought that we are important enough to learn about, to want to talk to recognize and be fully present with us. Well, that's the premise of this week's movie, It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It's the story of Mr. Rogers and journalist Lloyd Vogel, who was tasked to write a story about Mr. Rogers as part of a series on modern-day heroes. And a wonderful friendship arose from that particular assignment, mostly because Mr. Rogers had this wonderful ability to make people feel heard and important. As Mr. Rogers says in the movie, on one of those phone calls to Lloyd, "Do you know what the most important thing in the world is to me right now?" Lloyd says, no. And Mr. Rogers replied, talking on the telephone to Lloyd Vogel, "How can you resist something like that? How can you not want to be a part of that story, of that life?" Which brings us to our scripture text today. Thank you for reading that so beautifully, Jean. And perhaps we love this story of David and Goliath so much because there are times in all of our lives where we face challenges that seem gigantic, absolutely enormous. And it's good for us to remember that David just doesn't all of a sudden get courage because he's in a difficult situation. Rather, it's all of those things that have gone in our life beforehand that prepare us for every moment. So David's courage actually began in his shepherding, his past, which became a crucial part of the courage that he was able to display. And so I invite us too to begin focusing on the many ways in the past that God has provided and sustained and protected us. Because then, when we face those enormous giants, whether it's sickness, a family breakup, financial disaster, addictions, shame, that same God who protected and provided for us in the past is always ready to do so again. But it's only when we name our giants and trust that God will be with us as we face them, that we're going to be able to manage those giants that appear in our lives. In a wonderful scene in the movie, the family is gathered around Jerry, who is Lloyd's father. He is on his deathbed, and they're all talking and laughing together. Fred Rogers is watching very quietly in the corner. And when Lorraine, who is Lloyd's sister, jokingly suggests that everybody just join her for a family vacation while she's on her honeymoon, Jerry promises to be there. And wheezing somewhat, he says, "Crash your honeymoon, count me in if I'm still here." The room gets really quiet, and people are sort of looking down at the ground. And Fred, who notices the change, says, "You know, death is something many of us are uncomfortable speaking about. But to die is to be human. And anything human is mentionable. Anything mentionable is manageable." And he looks at Lloyd and he repeats that. Anything mentionable is manageable. Isn't that the most profound thing you've heard all morning? I think David understood that, and he laid out all the obstacles that were in front of him and then managed the situation with God's help. I mean, God knew David's name. David had previously been anointed king by the prophet Samuel, and David absolutely trusted the one who knew him. Anything mentionable is manageable. Now, that doesn't mean that everything we mention will be managed well. I mean, there are certainly times when our best laid plans go absolutely awry. And so there's this wonderful scene in the movie where Mr. Rogers is trying to put up a tent in the episode of the show. Anybody tried to put up a full-size tent by themselves? Well, you can imagine some of the things that might have happened in this episode. And of course, the directors and the managers of the set, they wanted, after they saw this happen, they wanted to step in and pre-set up the tent and eliminate that struggle so that they can get to the point of the story. But Mr. Rogers, he goes to the camera and he watches the take and he tells them to keep it in. And he remarks, children need to know that sometimes when we make plans, they don't work out. And there are all sorts of experiences in life like that change us, that help us understand life in new ways. Now, there are some episodes of absolute joy that can have that effect, but it's often the experiences of pain and struggle and working through misunderstandings that mark us for life and influence the course of all of our days to come. We call those crises. And the word crisis comes from Latin, before that Greek, and the original meaning is decision, or we might say point of decision. So when you're in a crisis, events tumble in fast and furious. Now, you may want to just go to bed and cover up your head, but if it's a genuine crisis, that's impossible, because a crisis forces some sort of a decision. It may be a bad decision, but a decision has to be made, because inaction in a crisis is not an option. We could, I suppose, say that not doing anything would be a course of action, but and is itself a choice, but that is not going to help you through any kind of crisis. General George S. Patton knew something about crises. His experience as a combat general during one crisis after another. In sharing his own philosophy of dealing with crises, Patton had this to say: a good solution applied with vigor now is better than a perfect solution applied 10 minutes later. Spoken like a true crisis manager. You find yourself in a crisis, and you have to act. And both Mr. Rogers, in his dealing with the everyday world of television, of children, of things that are going on in the world, and our scripture lesson with the story of David and Goliath, they are both stories of crises. So I'd like for us to step into David's point of view just for a second. I mean, David, you just imagine, David had never seen so many soldiers in one place. The Philistine army was spread all across the battlefield, ready for action. There was a sea of breastplates, helmets, leather, the sunlight glinting off the bronze. And at the vanguard stands Goliath, their champion. And can't you just see him? I mean, I think of the Jolly Green Giant. I think maybe that was sort of used Goliath as a model, but he's got these two mighty legs planted in the ground like powerful tree trunks. And Goliath, you might say, was the shock and awe of the Philistine army. And that shock and awe thing, it was working, because the soldiers of Judah can find no champion brave enough to take the field against him, not even Saul, the king. So when David steps forward, that was a really odd choice. He's only a boy, a shepherd who is the son of a shepherd, truly, truly a nobody. And I love the part of the story where Saul offers to loan David his armor. You just imagine, David must have been so excited, right, to wear the king's armor. Can you just imagine how cool that would have been? And then he puts like the helmet on and it comes all the way down over his face, and he puts the breastplate on. He probably falls forward. I'm not exactly sure what happened because we're not told, but I have seen kids try to put on things that are way too big and way too heavy for them. And so that initial thrill obviously died down pretty quickly when he saw how awkwardly it hung down from his body. And so David casts that aside. That particular thing that worked beautifully for Saul was not going to work for David. So as he takes the field, remember that big field, the whole army, Goliath planted at the head, he is wearing only the homespun tunic of a shepherd. And the only weapon that is hanging from his hand is a simple leather sling, a strap with a pouch at one end designed to hold a single stone. Now, friends, if you're Goliath, can you even begin to take this seriously? I mean, it's true that a great many of the combat challenges that Goliath has faced have ended in immediate surrender, and I am absolutely sure he was expecting the same thing because that man really was that big. But David didn't back down. Today, Goliath actually has an opponent, if you could call him that. And all of us know what happens after there's a wonderful interlude of trash talking by both Goliath, and David gives it right back to him. And after that little communication with each other across the field, they had to be yelling at each other in order to be heard. David reaches into his shoulder bag. He pulls out one of 5 smooth stones that he's chosen from a dry stream bed, and he places it in his sling. Can't you just see now Goliath is coming to him, right? I'm guessing he's not a speedster at that size. And then all of a sudden, with this cry, David starts running rapidly toward the giant's direction, swinging his sling around his head. Now, I'm guessing Goliath has no clue what is happening. This has never happened to him before, and he probably thinks he's going to, put his thumb, squash, whatever. But before his opponent, before Goliath can even figure out what to do, what's happening to him, David snaps his wrist. So it goes like this. He snaps his wrist, sends that stone flying into the enemy's forehead, killing him like that. And it turns out that this gangly teenager has been practicing this skill his whole life, working as a shepherd. And he's killed dozens of wild beasts with that sling of his. So he might look like a comic figure. We know that he discarded Saul's armor. I bet that was a lot of laughs for the Judean army when he did that. But put a sling in David's hand, and he knows how to use it. And he's a master with that particular weapon. The interesting thing is a sling can kill before any other weapon is in range, except maybe a bow and arrow, but we pretty much know that Goliath was more of a sword and javelin kind of a guy. So in this moment of crisis, David knows exactly what to do, and he does it. So what about the giants that beset our lives? How do we discover this inner sense of knowing and peace and confidence and tap into its power? How does Mr. Rogers do that? In the movie, prior to the scene that I described about Jerry at his deathbed, Lloyd is actually at his sister's wedding reception when Jerry, who up to that point has been estranged from Lloyd, approaches. He tries to make small talk. Jerry, who is actually quite an obnoxious drunk who abandoned Lloyd when his mother became ill, is trying to mend fences. But Lloyd has a whole lot of unresolved anger. And so when Jerry makes a minor comment about Lloyd's mother, Lloyd absolutely loses it, punches Jerry in the face, a fight breaks out. the wedding reception is disrupted, and there truly is a crisis moment. And later then, Mr. Rogers shows his child audience a picture of Lloyd after that fight, looking battered and very, very lost. And Mr. Rogers says, have you ever felt the way Lloyd does? So angry that you want to hurt someone or yourself? I know I have. When I was a boy, I was very chubby, and the other kids would chase me and call me names like Fat Freddy. It made me very sad. Sometimes when I was by myself, I would cry. Other times it made me very angry. And then he said the line that is quite famous in Mr. Rogers' World. I can remember it from watching it with my kids. There is always something you can do with the mad that you feel. And whether it's the mad that you feel when you're hurt, when things aren't going your way, or when you're fighting giants in your life, there's a lot we can learn from this story of David and Goliath. First is humility. Focus, keeping what is right in front of you as a priority. To put this in perspective, have any of you ever gone to do something in your house, got sidetracked by something, and then totally forgot what it was you were going to do? Okay, some of you are as unfocused as I am. Focusing in a crisis, though, becomes extraordinarily important. And then, of course, there's trusting God, knowing that God's promises are real and true, not just for the whole world, not just for people who live a great life, but for every single one of us. So friends, whether ourselves, we can trust that God has great ideas for how to live our lives. And we can overcome those day-to-day or month-by-month crises in our lives by learning to center ourselves, to focus on the lives that God has given us to live, and to stay in regular communication with the God who loves us, who guides us, who gives us the strength when we need it the most. In another scene in the movie, Lloyd has just been introduced to Mrs. Fred Rogers, whose name is Joanne, and he asks, so how does it feel to be married to a living saint? And she replies, you know, I'm not fond of that term. All you wives, I'll score. If you think of him as a saint, then his way of being is unattainable. You know, he works at it all the time. It's a practice. He's not a perfect person. He has a temper, but he chooses how to respond to that anger. And he does things every day that help ground him. He reads scripture, swims laps, prays for people by name, writes letters, hundreds of them. The two of them then look out the window where Mr. Rogers is greeting his fans. He's greeting each one personally, giving of himself as he always does. So where might God be calling you today to step out, to personally give of yourself, maybe to learn someone's name, to make it a beautiful day in your neighborhood?